Hey guys, King of Charmander here. Today I'll be your judge, your jury, and your analyst. And today we are going to analyze Ultra Premier Classic. Because, you know, when XL's released, they took the, basically, it's, if you played Master Premier Cup all the way back in the day, this is what it is. No XLs, no legendaries. Yeah, they just had to put some fancy name behind it because the guys were like, somewhere in Niantic HQ was like, okay, so how do we name this? Let's just use Classic instead of Cup, and then it'll fix everything, right? I was right on the predictions, but anyways, as I always say, please consider contributing to ppoke.com. So Ultra Premier Classic is actually pretty freaking weird, and I'm surprised I can actually say that fluently because I used to jack it up all the time, especially doing the early meta-analysis. So, what this means, there are no XLs and there are no legendaries. If you played Ultra Premier Cup before XL's release, this is basically what it is. As you see here, it dominates by Swampert, Venusaur. In other words, community mons are very, very powerful. There are also Sylveon, things like Sylveon. Nido Queen is a big shocker. Nido Queen is huge in this cup because of its ability to essentially... It gives Magnezone an incredibly difficult time, and you can also Poison Fang down a lot of things. In the 2-shield, you could beat things like Dragonite. You can also Poison Fang down like Kingdras, etc. It's a very dangerous mon. Of course, what balances it out is the fact that the Water-type archetype is very strong in Ultra Premier Classic. So, you're going to see Swamperts a lot, you're going to see Venusaurs a lot, and there's a whole lot of combinations here that actually work. If you don't have XLs, and you want to play this cup, there's a lot of things that work in this cup, and I'm going to give you top 5 teams that have either worked in the past, and I've practiced with them and trained with them, and they're still pretty dang good. Without further ado, let's get started. Alright, you probably really recognize team. This is the Empoleon Double Dragon team. It hasn't changed at all. This is the team where if you lose the lead, you will say switch into Kingdra, and then you pray you get the debuff with Octazooka. Still incredibly effective and still really annoying, and it still works, even a year later. This is mostly because the Poison-type archetype, like I mentioned, a lot of them carry ground, Nido Queen, etc., like I'm talking about. Empoleon is also really good against things like Sylveon. It effectively walls Sylveon, actually, so, that being said, old school is still really, really good. So, you lose the lead, you switch into Kingdra, and then you just realign. It's super basic, terrible stats, and the only thing about this team that's really good is it does consistent amount of damage. Like I mentioned, you will be flipping coins because you're going to hope you got heads or tails, whichever one you call right, and then you're going to hope you get the debuff with Kingdra. However, despite that, this team is still really freaking good. As you see here, it's very, very powerful. Again, you lose the lead, all you do is say switch into Kingdra, you get the debuff, and then you go to town. This team has allowed many players to get to Legend just because of its simplicity, and like I said, you really heavily rely on luck. But it's still very powerful, even though it has a very ridiculously high threat score. The reason why this team is so strong is because of Dragon Breath damage. Like, if you have a Dragon Tail Dragonite, maybe, like, give it a shot, but as you see, Double Dragon and just Dragon moves in general, Dragon Tail and Dragon Breath still do a humongous amount of damage. Again, you lose the lead, say switch into Kingdra, and then just realign everything, and then GG's. That's how simple this team is, but because there hasn't really been any game-breaking additions, XLs are what really broke Ultra Premier. If you revert it back to the old one, the old style, nothing really changes much at all. Unless, in other words, what I'm trying to say, there's no brand new Pokemon out there that's really flipped this meta on its head since last year. Alright, next up we have Magnezone, Magnezone, Gallade, Safe Switch, and then Venusaur. For those of you that don't know, this is Jonkus' team. Well, if you recognize it, you probably know it's Jonkus' team, and it's still really freaking good. It slowly dropped off over time down the years, just because everyone started countering it, that, or the fact that it's just, like, it's also incredibly squishy, but... Nothing really like hardwall this team or anything like that. It has a lot of charge move pressure, and because of that, it does really, really well. As you see here, this team is great for coverage, D for bulk, like I mentioned. They're all really squishy. What squishy means is you're not very thick. If you're not very thick, that means you're going to take a lot of damage, and if you take a lot of damage, that means you're dead. So, as you see, really safe team though, and also very consistent. Gallade Safe Switch is still incredibly powerful, and essentially this is, Magnezone's also a powerful Safe Switch, so it uses the Safe Switch in the front. Gallade break shields, Venusaur sweeps, basically. And if you get a Venusaur into a Swampert, it's a great time. But as you see here, even against the overall meta, literally a year later, it's still really good. Just because of the fact that all three of these mons do an insane amount of damage, and you can realign, have great energy management, and this team will do really well for you. That, or you can close combat through shields with Gallade, and you're going to kill something like a Snorlax or something like that. Happened a lot, seen it happen a lot, and this team has helped a lot of people make Legend or climb Elo. As you see here, even though nothing in the meta really switched it around that much, Malamar can give you kind of an issue, but the fact of the matter is superpower, like, it has to superpower, and it's a very... Malamar is basically the only thing that possibly give you a hard time, but Magnezone is still very strong because of the charge move pressure. Cofregus, Typhlosion, Gliscor, there's a lot of things that can take on this team, especially with Incinerate going on, so there has been a lot more creativeness, but despite that, this team is still very, very powerful, as you see here. It still has a B for coverage despite all the changes, etc. You're not going to see too many Gliscors, Exeggutor. You could possibly see a Alolan Exeggutor? Maybe? Well, not really. That's the long neck one, not the actual, like, Pine Tree one that I'm thinking about. Typhlosion, obviously Typhlosion is a bad matchup in general, just because if you see a fire type in the lead, fire types will generally beat this entire team. Again, Malifar, that's why you lose against Delphox. Magnezone also has a terrible matchup against Nido Queen. I would say that's the only thing you really have to watch out for. You can say switch in a Gallade and then have Venusaur line up with Nido Queen, but it's still very, very rough because Nido Queen with one Earth Power will wipe Magnezone, and Nido Queen is a very powerful mon. That's the only thing that would probably give you an issue if you saw it in Ultra Premier Classic. Alright, next up we have Dragonite, Magnezone Safe Switch, and Venusaur to close out. This was a previous top team that I actually climbed like 200 elo with, but I'm not sure how it is nowadays for one particular reason. Well, I'll mention that later, but as you see, it's incredibly safe. Not a lot of bulk in Ultra Premier Cup. Unfortunately, unless you're logging like a ton of Snorlaxes, etc., you're probably, well, unless you have Snorlax in your team or Lapras, it's probably not going to have a high bulk rating. But other than that, it still has great coverage and great consistency. Dragonite leads are still really good. Dragonite is still really good against things like Gallade. Of course, like Gallade, fighting types like Machamp or Surfetch'd. Of course, Dragonite also beats Swampert, Venusaur, basically most of the elemental Pokemon. Magnezone's a great safe switch because it breaks shields, etc. Except for one thing. If you see a Nido Queen. Nido Queen is your worst nightmare. So what happens here is if you find, like, what happens is that Nido Queen beats Dragonite into 2 shields. So what's going to happen here is that you're going to essentially just sacrifice Dragonite in the lead. If you see Nido Queen, farm down with Venusaur, and hopefully Venusaur with energy and Magnezone can close out. Other than that, if you're still, the thing about Ultra Premier Classic is that you're still prone to rock, paper, scissors as with every game. So, if you see Nido Queen, as long as you get in the lead, you're fine. Or if you close out against it with Venusaur and you have enough energy, you could double Frenzy Planet to death. So, not super bad. But, as you see, this team is still really good. Pretty low threat score at 650. I wouldn't say 650 is low, but in comparison to a lot of other teams, like the Double Dragon team, I would say 650 is pretty decent. So this team, if you like Dragonite, if you like Magnezone Safe Switch, Magnezone Safe Switch is a little clumsy, but it still works really well. That's why it's ranked so high for Ultra Premier Classic. And then, like I mentioned, if you have great energy management, then Venusaur is always going to be a beast. So just keep that in mind. It's really freaking good. And this team can do really well for you in Ultra Premier Classic. Alright, so remember I talked about Snorlax? Well, this team does have Snorlax in it. Snorlax is still a very fantastic safe switch, outside of getting locked into a fighter, which can happen sometimes, but, like, you know, you can always have a fighter in the back, and like I mentioned, RPS is always there. But you know what? The reason why this team is very good is because it actually hard counters the Jonkus team, so Machamp beats Magnezone. Fun fact about Snorlax. Snorlax with Earthquake will actually beat Venusaur in the 2 shield. Venusaur must shield both body slams, and then you could Earthquake it to KO. It's a pretty convincing win. Then Gengar goes in the back and Shadow Punches the poor Gallade to death, just because of the fact that even though Gengar versus, like, a Confusion user is, like, the scariest thing in the world, but Shadow Punch will be able to KO. So This team is very, very powerful. A for consistency and A for safety. Not a lot of bulk. Remember that conversation I had? Ultra Premier Classic doesn't have a lot of bulky Pokemon, but you have a B for consistency. And this team is going to do a lot of consistent damage. If you lose the lead, you could either choose to sack Machamp or try to bulldoze through in the lead and then realign, or you could say switch into Snorlax and try to close out. The only difficult thing about this team is that if you look over here, Swampert is an absolute nightmare. You're gonna have to beat the unholy crap out of it with Machamp, and then you're gonna have to like farm down with Gengar and Snorlax, etc. Machamp also has to, if you play against Dragonite, you have to hit the Rock Slide on Dragonite in order to win. If you hit the Rock Slide, that's great. You take out the Dragonite, but at the same time, it's still a rough matchup anyway, so it's really up to you. Another thing about Machamp is the fact that Charmers and Confusion users, yes, Sylveon is a thing, and it's actually pretty good in this cup just for the mere fact that it has Psyshock. Other than getting walled by Empoleon, so there's some pros and cons. But this team has a lot of pressure, and it's pretty dang safe. Snorlax with Earthquake also gives you that added benefit to where you're not going to superpower a lot of things here, and Earthquake can possibly give you a win condition against things like Drag Algae, okay? Drag Algae. You can roast me in the comments, but it's Drag Algae. And again, like I mentioned, that 2 shield against Venusaur. Venusaur has to shield both body slams, otherwise you could Earthquake it to death, and it can possibly give you a win con against Nido Queen with Earthquake. So, Earthquake Snorlax is good, and you can also Earthquake Empoleon, so it's a very, very mean mod. Other than that, this team does have a relatively high threat score just because of Swampert. And if you play Machamp anyways, and you use this team, you're probably used to using Machamp in Ultra Premier Cup, or Ultra Premier Classic, as in last year, because Machamp is still a pretty popular lead in this cup. Just for the mere fact, Cross Chop does a ton of damage, and like I mentioned with Rock Slide, you could take out Dragonite and other flyers. And last but not least, we have Shadow Nido, well, not Shadow Nido Queen, regular Nido Queen. You could use a Shadow too, but the regular one, I like the regular one just because the bulk is up to you. Gallade as your safe switch, and then you have Shadow Gyarados. So, fun fact about Shadow Gyarados. Shadow Gyarados will beat Empoleon in the 2 shield. If you get the Crunch debuff, it's even worse for them, but as you see here, it's pretty convincing. They have to shield Aqua Tail, otherwise you can take this matchup. So, Shadow Gyarados also does really well against things like Swampert, etc. Given that you have enough damage, because Swampert doesn't have too bad of a matchup against Gyarados, but Dragon Breath damage is still really real, and the fact that you take out Empoleon is really good, especially giving you that extra support for Nido Queen. Of course, you have Gallade for Empoleon if you get an Empoleon switched into you, or like if you have to switch into it. But the Empoleon is either going to have to 1, call the close combat, or 2, it's still going to be a rough matchup for you. This uses the Gallade engine, B for coverage, A for safety, B for consistency. Not a lot of bulk. Again, Ultra Premier Classic. Not a lot of bulk for anything. But this team does really, really well against a lot of combinations. Nido Queen is a solid lead. It takes out the Charmers. It takes out Machamp. It also takes out Dragonite in the 2 shield. As you see, it really does wonders against a lot of things. It also has a lot of impact against Magnezone. Now, the things that are going to make you extremely angry is going to be Swampert and, of course, Empoleon. You are incredibly weak against both of those. But like I mentioned here, you have Gallade and Shadow Gyarados to try to close out that matchup. Or just line up against them. Now, if you get the Gallade in the lead, it really sucks because as you see here, you have to switch out, but you could force the mirror and then you can try to realign as you see here. You're not probably going to see a Milotic. Skarmory has to be a perfect, and most of your opponents probably excel them. I don't foresee a Hundo Skarmory to be in this cup. Galarian Rapidash, very powerful, but also I don't foresee it to be here in this cup a lot, especially with the fact that Magnezone is a thing, so just putting that out there. Jellicent, if someone is going to bring a Hundo Jellicent, remember, XLs aren't allowed here, so Jellicent doesn't max out at 2,500. So, Nido Queen is a pretty solid lead. It's also it's one of the most powerful safe switches just for the fact that you can, there's a lot of things you can do with it. Unfortunately, like I mentioned, it's really prone to losing against Gallade, so just be really careful. This team has a pretty low threat score of 640. Again, like I mentioned, 640 is pretty low compared to a lot of teams out there. You're not going to find teams with a tremendously low threat score in this cup. It's just the way it is. But Ultra Premier Classic is a lot of fun. If you played it last year because it used to be the old OG Ultra Premier Cup and you did well in it, well, you're going to be really happy that it's back for this season. And that's GG's. As you notice, this meta doesn't really take as much analysis compared to a lot of things, but hopefully either the old teams that I presented to you or the budget teams, which are actually very strong for Ultra Premier Classic, and they will be available pretty soon. So the thing is here is that, like, what's interesting is that statistically, budget teams like triple community moves, as it has been very statistically powerful for a long time, for basically the entirety of Ultra Premier Classic, or Ultra Premier Cup way back in the day. So look out for those budget teams to come out. But what I'm saying basically is that there are really cheap teams out here that are actually, I would say, rank in top 10 or even top 5. That's how strong budget teams are in Ultra Premier Classic. So I'm going to put those teams out there, and like I mentioned, I didn't put them in these teams just because this will give you a whole lot of looks. If not, you're already thinking about running one of these teams, or you're going to give them a shot and see how they perform, see how they do. Do me a huge favor, please like and subscribe. All you have to do that is to put your mouse under that bottom right. You see that little thing that says sub? Put your mouse over it, you'll easily sub from there. Really appreciate my current subscribers. Good luck on your Go Battle League sets, and I will see you guys on the next video.
Ciao!